initiated an exploration of what we're up to next, which is changing timelines. There's some guidelines about changing timelines. If you want to follow along, I'm going to read these briefly. They're in your handouts on page number 12. It's called Knowing When to Change Timelines. Thing to keep in mind is that any outcome, any personal outcome, can be approached usefully through timelines. And here's some indicators that a timeline change might be useful. Signs that changing future codings may be useful. All right. Having trouble planning for the future. Just see if any of these resonate with you. Just, you feel like it would be useful. Having trouble planning for the future, lacking goals or motivation, direction, lacking motivation, difficulty making changes in unwanted habits, drug abuse. These are signs that changing future codings might be useful. Signs that changing past codings might be useful. Being preoccupied with the past, not being able to remember the past, not learning from past mistakes, being depressed. Other indications that a timeline coding shift may be useful is not having a present or a future. Having a future that is very short, in the sense that it ends too early. And we've discussed this one already. When eye-accessing cues are reversed with respect to the timeline, normally past corresponds to visual remembered and future to visual construct. Difficulty noticing the difference between past and future, in other words, what's happened and what will happen. Dark, dim, or gray timelines may be usefully changed. So a couple other fine points here. There is no ideal timeline, right? There is no, like, this is the perfect timeline for folks. Every way of coding time will have advantages and disadvantages, and with a little experience you can predict which is which by knowing a person's timeline. Each of us can find our own best arrangement and shift how we arrange time in different contexts. So your timeline structure may be different based on the context. In other words, a time when you want to be in kind of a meta position, reviewing and making long-term plans, the timeline coding may be very different than a timeline coding you would use in the context of wanting high motivation for a task that's coming up in the near future. You literally might want to structure your timelines differently in each context. This means that when you do timeline work, it's important to make any changes with respect to you or your client's outcomes. You ask, what outcome do you want by changing your timeline? So the shifts are in relationship to an outcome. Having different ways to code time in different contexts can give you more flexibility. You may decide you want to keep your current timeline in some context and add another method in other contexts. For instance, if you've arranged your timeline in a typical V, past, future, that kind of thing, which is fairly usual, you may benefit from putting your past behind you and your future straight out in front of you in some contexts. If you've done the latter, you may benefit from this V structure. Each has predictable advantages and disadvantages. So questions about this little review? Yeah. Yeah, well, consider the notion of depression, right? Depression is what? An emotional state, right? It's an emotional response to what? Right, at the level of submodalities, but when you're around somebody who's depressed, what are they talking about usually? Yeah, negative. What kind of negative things? Right. Yeah. So it's kind of like, well, it never works out. I just can't. Every time I try something new, and it doesn't work. Same old, time after time after time. Right. Yeah. It could be a kind of a reflection of projecting past problems into the future, right? I mean, depression, in my experience, comes out of overwhelming repetition of unpleasant states. Depression's a unique thing because depression is kind of a meta problem, right? Depression is kind of a response to things that are stuck in our lives and don't change, right? And if they don't change for a sufficient period of time, we kind of reach this threshold, and then we get depressed about them. There's always an about with depression, right? we're depressed about something. Right? If we feel angry or whatever, it's generally like a stimulus response. It's there, it's gone. But depression tends to be pernicious. It tends to permeate the whole system. So it's in response to this kind of stuck, repetitive pattern quite often.
And so working with depression also can result in features of abuse, hard growing up and being abused in an abusive relationship, or
Right.
growing up and being possibly rape or
Right.
violence and so
Right. Traumatic events.
traumatic events. That's
Right.
it. Yeah.
If you have traumatic events in your past, I mean, like really traumatic ones, and time passes, I mean, we all understand enough about, kind of the natural progress of life to understand that we form generalizations about the safety of the world, other people that we can trust, et cetera, et cetera. So we tend to enact those. We grow through time. We get to be 30 or 40 years old. We've had a violently abusive past. What kind of timeline codings do you think a person might have? Or in your experience of working with others, what kinds of timeline codings do people who have had traumatic experiences, how do they code these experiences?
There could be a blank spot in their timeline.
Oftentimes there is. If it's something that, as an adaptive measure, the unconscious has said, man, this is just too much to even deal with, spontaneously the unconscious begins to code the timeline to obscure it. So, you work with folks who literally have dark spots, dark areas on their timeline, or it's a fog, where they kind of know something's there, right? But explicit kinds of memories are unavailable to them as an adaptive measure, right? Now, think about the kind of thing that, remember the phobia trauma procedure from the practitioner training, right? This is, and a phobia or a trauma is when you see something in the environment is like an anchor, and it fires off a past memory. So it kind of pops up from the timeline. When it does, traumatic events, how do you suppose they're coded with submodalities? The memory of a traumatic event. Big, bright, clear, associated, 3D, stereo sound, real rich in submodalities. Right. Sometimes, yeah. They really get your attention, right? And you have a overwhelming emotional response. And the phobia trauma procedure, which is a submodality procedure, right, restructures the way that the mind, your internal computation, deals with this event. So it shifts the way you represent it in terms of submodalities. After a phobia trauma procedure, generally, and possibly some other backup work, generally a person can review a past event, right, and with no, undue emotional response. And one reason is that the submodalities have changed. It's no longer huge, big, overwhelming, screaming at them or whatever. It's receded. It's kind of like what Ron was talking about, a big event in the future versus one that's easier if it's seen down here. Right?
So what do you change the cause?
Say again?
You change the cause for
Depression?
depression?
Part of it, ultimately, it all depends on information gathering. You have to find out exactly how they're structuring time and what's going on in there. But it's simply that, if someone is talking about a problem of ongoing depression, then you kind of go, I wonder how they're structuring time. Wonder what their timelines are like. And you begin to explore that.
It seems common in people I work with is most people don't have a future if they're depressed for whatever reason. Like there's
Often
a loss,
preoccupied with the past.
where there's a loss and they can't
Right.
imagine a future without
Right.
that, whatever that was.
Think about the statistics, the insurance companies have come up with these. Loss of a spouse, loss of a job, right? Tends to shorten timelines. And now that we understand a bit about timelines, this makes perfect sense. You're married, you've been married 30 years, you're planning on the retirement in Florida when you're 70, and living on into a golden future, and the two of you have these marvelous timelines, and it's just beautiful, and you share them, right? And then suddenly, boom, one's gone. And what happens to the timeline? Poof! So your identity has changed. You are no longer who you always believed you were, right? And it's, what do you do? Right? So, this thing of early death in those situations, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy in a sense. Because, literally, the timeline structures, well, it's over. There's nothing in the future. Right? I worked with a woman who, partly her thing was depression, and partly it was unable to enact future plans. In other words, the future had no attraction to her at all. Right? And it was upsetting because in the past, her future had, right? But when I was working with her, there was no compelling motivation to do anything or enact new projects or get engaged in the future, right? And so I began to explore her timeline, and her timeline structure was that it ended quite early, right? Within a number of years. And then the further I explored that for causality, and this is why it's so fascinating working with people. We thought we were working on creating futures for this kind of thing, motivation. Right? Turned out to be smoking, right? Because she'd bought into the, Surgeon General's shortened life, et cetera, and all her friends were trying to get her to quit smoking. I'll kill you, It's like, my God, you're taking 20 minutes off your life this kind of thing. And she had allowed that to kind of come in at an unconscious level and modify her structure of time, where she had begun to, just through this association and input, begin to generate a belief that if I keep smoking, I'm going to be dead in a couple of years. All right, so, right, so the timeline. So, prior to proceeding to this thing of motivating, compelling futures, we had to deal with that whole thing, right? And one of the things we had to do is create an alternative timeline, right? So what kind of timeline? Let's assume that we could create another. We'll leave the smoking one where it ends down here. Just leave that for a moment. That's always a possibility for you. But if this changes, what then? Right? And then we began to structure in the behaviors, the activities, the kinds of changes she would have to make. Then if she made it, it's an as-if frame, right? If she had made these changes, what then would be on the future? What kinds of things could she look forward to if it did continue? And that began to be so compelling, but it became the prime motivator to quit smoking. Right? So the smoking was there, but it wasn't the sort of designated outcome of the whole thing, but it needed to be dealt with, and her beliefs around it. Yeah.
Did you ever work with the other type of depression? Because what we are talking about now is a reactive depression.
Right.
Which is normally not the difficult thing. You find what it is about and you're kind of done with it.
Shift the causality, yeah.
Right. But with what is called internal depression, that is something totally different because nobody can pinpoint an event in the person's life to which there is a causal reaction.
Right.
Did you work with that too?
Yeah. So it was, in a sense, it was similar to this woman. And one of the things that I have found in those situations is that they're very ill-formed, compelling future representations. It's kind of like, what's the point? Why bother?
Yeah, they don't bother
Right.
at all.
There's
they
nothing
don't
there.
even bother thinking about it.
Right. Right. Well, that's interesting. They don't bother thinking about it because there's nothing there to think about. Right? It's like there is no generative pictures, no generative imagery on a future timeline, and yet there's something in them that knows that there kind of should be. Right?
I find the energy lacking in these people. So to get them to think about
Right.
it, and that is your point. The energy doesn't go there
Right.
because it's not
Right.
compelling.
It just stagnates. Right? And then you also want to explore what is it that, how is that pattern generated? Right?
But if you start to make that future compelling, they'll go, nah, won't happen. It isn't true.
It's unrealistic. You
Yeah.
don't see it as real.
Right.
Maybe you got to find out what.
Because they have problems enough moving their ass out of bed in the morning.
Right. So how do you make a timeline real? How do you give it subjective?
Repetition, I think, makes it more real. Like going through it several times. Whatever submodalities that they use to determine whether something is real, that you can even take their depression state,
Right.
find out what submodalities they have, and maybe altering it somehow.
Right. Consider the notion of certainty. A person like this, we're just kind of role-playing this. We don't have the person in front of us to know precisely what the structure is. Take the notion of certainty. Even a person like this, they're going to have a sense of, a sense of certainty that the sun's going to come up tomorrow. Right? It's something they've experienced all their lives. So they could think about the sun coming up tomorrow. Right? And if they're thinking about the sun coming up tomorrow and they're certain that it's going to, guess how they're coding it with submodalities? They're coding it with the submodality of certainty. Right? I want you to think, for example, something that you're sure you're going to do in the next 4 or 5 days. You got study groups, you got the weekend, you got evening presentations. Pick one of those that you're sure you're going to go. You're going to go to a study group, you're going to go to a presentation, you do something on the weekend. Right? Pick one of those. Then I want you to do a submodality exploration of it. Check out the submodalities. You can link it to your timeline, if that's comfortable, where it fits on your timeline. But I want you to investigate the visual, auditory, and kinesthetic submodalities: size, brightness, panorama, three-dimension movie, associated, dissociated, and then auditory, source of the sound, panorama, stereophonic, tone, pitch, tempo, volume, and where it fits on the side of the timeline in relationship to other events in your life in the future that you anticipate. And simply by this representation that you're sure it's going to happen. Right? You do a submodality inventory. And you could jot these down, piece of paper, so you got this full inventory. Everybody got that experience? Now, I'd like you to think of something you'd like to do in the next week, but you're not going to. You don't have time, it's too far away or something. You'd like to do it, but it's just not going to happen. Like you'd like to go to Hot Sulphur Springs tomorrow night to the hot baths and sit there in the sauna and get a soak and a massage and relax for 4 or 5 hours. You really like to, but you're not going to, right? So think of one of those. Now everybody's going to Hot Sulphur. Something you'd like to do, but you're not going to, right? So check one of those out. Just choose something. Could be anything. You'd like to climb to the top of that mountain over there. It'd be fun. It'd be great to see the view, but you're not going to climb to the top of that mountain, except for Michael. He'll do it. All right? Something you'd like to do, you're not going to, and inventory the submodalities: visual, auditory, and kinesthetic. Particularly investigating the differences between these two in terms of submodalities. It could have something to do with where or how it fits on your timeline. It could be something to do with size, brightness, color, sound. Often these imagined events have a sense of kind of floating. They're not quite locked into the timeline. They could be different location. Yes, please. Okay, does anyone have those coded in exactly the same submodalities besides Rachel? Our little special child. Yes? They're exactly the same?
I'm trying to find a difference, and you know what? It's interesting because as far as something I know I'm going to do, and then something I would like to do, because the possibility of like is still, is oftentimes there's things that I know, and there's oftentimes there's things that I would like to do it, and I do it.
Okay.
Anyways,
Well, this is a different thing. This is a like to do, and you're going to do it.
And because for me, possibility is anything's possible.
Right.
And I get in trouble with that from my wife.
Interesting.
Because I'll be going and doing something, and there's something I would like to do, and it's back there, and then all of a sudden there I am. I'm gone, and I get in trouble. And also when we're talking about timelines too, before I was married, my timeline had different branches, I'm going into the future, different branches. Now that I'm married, I really had to adjust it. And I'm still
having trouble walking that path, man.
And I am
It's like,
still working.
I keep
I'm
straying
still,
over
I'm still
here,
working on it,
coming
and
back
I am.
here.
I'm still straying over here because that's what my past timeline was to going this way. But there's like so many different options.
Right.
And
But it's interesting to explore those types
I
of
still do that.
submodalities, yeah?
And I still do that. And,
Right.
and even with the possibility, what you said, well, Michael climbed to the top of the mountain. I'm going, okay, I would like to do that, but it's possible. I mean, I just
Right.
might
Now
take
you
off.
hear this guy wasn't following the directions. I said something
was
that
working,
right, he was trying to do
was
it, but he
trying,
says,
yeah.
well, if it could happen, hey, I could do it, right? So his wasn't coded as something I'd like to do and I'm not. It's something I'd like to do and I could do it. So those are going to be coded differently, right?
So I got to think of like, okay, I'm not going to go to the moon.
There you go.
It's
I'm
like
not going to
something-
walk
making
on the
some real
surface of,
distract.
walking on the surface of the sun, you know? I mean, well, I'll send my energy body later tonight via the drum
I
with
just might
Eagle
do
Brother, and in the east I'll walk on the sun. Yeah, right. So you understand that. Let me ask other folks, you hopefully detected some differences between something you fully anticipate occurring and something that is like a fantasy, right? So we're tracking here on Henrik's question. How do you get him out of bed? One thing is precisely this. Begin to explore the submodalities of certainty, right? Something very basic, and then chunk it down. Because, you're not going to be able to do a 20-year timeline for somebody like that.
Right.
You're going to educate them how to get out of bed and enjoy making breakfast.
Right,
And
20 days would be nice.
Exactly right. Start at a day at a time, week, et cetera. But then you can begin to code that future with the submodalities of whatever you choose. Certainty, desire, fun, whatever emotional state would tend to motivate them towards it until they begin to get familiar with that internal process, right? It's kind of like re-educating the unconscious, right? And again, as I was working with someone like this, I would be very curious about what led up to this?
Sure.
What path did they walk down to wind up here, right? So that you could make sure that pattern isn't repetitive in the future, right? Yes, you bet.
Changing future coding for drug abuse. I didn't understand that. I think, isn't it to change past experience?
Well, consider drug abuse. My wife, Bobby, she's a NLP trainer, and she spent a number of years working with youth at risk in a treatment facility. It was like a jail for kids. Most of them had problems with drugs. And these were teenagers. And one of the things that she discovered as she began to explore timelines, first of all, kind of as a general frame around teenagers, guess how long a teenager's timeline is? About like that. It's like, to the nearest event. Right? And this is characteristic of teenagers. This is why it's difficult for them to project consequences. It's difficult for them to plan. It's difficult for them to do things now they're going to pay off next week or next month, to get serious about their college education. All those things that the parents know are going to be useful, and they're trying to pound into a teenager's head. And you wonder why it doesn't go. It's like it's trying to fit into a future timeline that's about that big. Right? And with drugs, what happens with drugs is that they have an immediate, an explosive, kinesthetic experience of the moment now, right? That's what drugs do. They put you right here, right now, right? And they release all kinds of stuff, endorphins, emotional responses, et cetera, et cetera. So a person who is repetitively doing drugs, first of all, begins to develop a taste for that time structure. Right? And as a result, the consequences of that action are difficult for the person to even anticipate because there is no future representation. If I keep doing drugs, I'm going to wind up in the street in a dumpster. It just doesn't make sense.
Okay.
They either code it as a fantasy without a degree of certainty, which is a submodality coding, or the timeline is so vague that it's just not compelling. What's compelling is right now, when I can get my next shot or my next beer or whatever it is. So one of the things that Bobby discovered with these kids that really was useful was to begin to educate them in to timeline work.
Did she write anything about this?
In process.
In process.
Yeah, absolutely.
And when is this process
I'm seriously,
timeline?
I'm guessing initiated the work on it sometime between 9 months and a year, right? And it'll deal with working with kids at risk, youth at risk, primarily young girls, teenage girls. That's her specialty.
Put me on your list.
Sure.
Can this be applied on kids who are doing bad in school or not motivated at all
Sure.
to do anything?
Well, there are certain words that should be almost like timeline flags. Motivation is one of them.
Yeah,
Right.
because I work with not teenager, younger than teenager, and what they care for is the now.
Right.
They
Yeah.
don't.
Well,
Plus, let me just do one thing.
sure.
Our culture, they don't plan. We don't plan anything. We only rely on God's will. I mean, we never plan anything. Maybe I'm the only one who plans for the next 2 months, let's say. Okay, and this is reflected on kids also. So what is important is the now. What I'm getting now. This is what is important.
Right.
End of the year it doesn't exist for them.
So how old are these kids?
12, 13, let's say even 10.
Well, developmentally, they have the cognitive apparatus to generate timelines by that age. Younger than that age,
What
no.
does that mean?
That means that when you're 6 or 7,
Uh-huh.
right, it is pretty much now, right?
Sure.
Or you're exploring the nature of reality. You know, it's fairy tales and it's fantasy and it should be that way. And even younger than that, there's just sort of a bliss state in the age of 3 and younger. By the time you reach puberty, 12, 13, then literally the neurology has the capacity to generate these types of experiences, right? And it would be interesting in your culture to explore the types of timelines that various people have. Because different cultures are very different in their processing of time. You know, I mean, in Hawaii, first thing you got to do, to really articulate with the culture is learn about Hawaiian time. It doesn't use one of these, right?
No,
It's
we
totally
use, but
different.
future for us means next week. That's it. Maybe next month.
Right.
How does the government manage?
It's a reflection of
Yeah, right.
no, they have 5 years planning,
Yeah.
which is very hazy, very not clear.
Right. Well, now think about this. I mean, really, you think about, this is a very specific thing we're doing here, very small chunk submodality timeline. Think about this in terms of cultural expressions, right? That some cultures tend to be more immediate. Some cultures, some Oriental cultures tend to have these amazing scopes of time. I mean, incredibly long timelines, and an understanding of time as this 23 million year cyclic breath of God, and it's reflected literally in the nature of the culture itself, right? And you experience this when you visit various cultures. Latin cultures, Mexican, South American, the Spanish influence tend to have a much more ample sense of the present, much less pressure on the future. This culture, the USA, Western European cultures, and to a certain extent some Oriental cultures, Japanese for one, have very refined future timelines, very specific, very small chunk,
Yeah.
not only as kind of a culture, but the individuals within that culture, right? Think about the difference in terms of just the capacity to generate, to internalize submodality representations between a person that spends 2 to 5 hours in front of a box flipping images, right? And educating their unconscious to handle this kind of capacity of sensory input. That kind of individual versus a 13-year-old Quechua Indian girl whose task is to watch the flocks of vicuña, and what she does is she sits all day and just kind of meditates. Right? literally training your processes, your mind-body system to work in different ways. So cultures express themselves differently just like people do.
We look
And-
at people who live paycheck to paycheck.
Yeah.
You know, they have 26 of those if they have it every 2 weeks per year.
That's right.
And that's what they do.
Right.
They live for the weekend and that's it.
That's it. That's what they're targeting. You know, they're going camping next weekend or whatever.
Or in the park.
Right. Yeah. And there are different things that affect timelines. Have a child. Maybe, you know, the first 6, 8, 9 years, that's one thing. But boy, 10, 11, you start thinking college. And so for this week-to-week guy, suddenly there's a new thread. How do we extend this kind of thing? Or think about retirement. You know, there are cultures in which retirement is
Doesn't
it's a
exist.
null set. There is no retirement. In our country, it seems as if younger and younger now, you're planning for your retirement, which is a projection of an immense timeline. You know, you're anticipating is going to occur. Right? And all of these things that we do in life have subjective reflections of how we code reality. Right? So let's do this. What we're going to do, given this discussion that we just went through on when shifting timeline codings may be useful, here's some guidelines for changing timelines. When you work with someone changing timelines, the first thing you want to do is frame what you're doing as an experiment. Right? In other words, they can always revert to what they've got when they started. This is nothing permanent unless it really works out for you, because the major frame around all of this is ecology. And when you're working with someone, and in this group it's going to be easy because you already have a sense of your timeline. First you determine what their timeline is, and then you begin to predict what timeline arrangement will achieve their outcome. So you're going to get together a partner, and you're going to have some outcome that you think might be beneficially impacted by changing your timeline. And your partner is going to kind of explore with you, well, how could we change your timeline to achieve the outcome you have in mind? Right? One thing you want to do is identify the positive outcome of the original timeline, because behind every behavior is a positive intent. And normally we think of behavior of doing something in the world, but the way you structure time is a behavior. It's a behavior that's primarily an unconscious process, but behind that behavior, the way you have structured your timeline, there is a positive intent. Right? So you want to just make sure that that's preserved, acknowledged, right? The original, for example, let's say a person's got a really abusive past history, and as a result, they've put their past behind them, right? And they've obscured it with, sort of blank spots in their timeline. And the positive intention of that is to protect them from the emotional response and memories of all these feelings. Right? Now, if you don't respect that positive intent, you go, okay, just bring your past over here and brighten it up. So you want to, again, let ecology be your guide, identify the positive outcome of the original timeline, and then explore how to best accomplish the outcomes that the person has. And with submodalities, there's a lot of different ways to do it. We've already had some examples. Ron is a good one, right? If you want to, if you're working with someone and say, well, I kind of get overwhelmed by all the things I have to do in the future. How do you have this coded in submodality? Big, bright pictures, even the interim tasks. Makes sense, right? Positive intent, you'd have to explore it, but it might be, well, to make sure I get it done. So you want to preserve that if you make the change. So in Ron's case, you could usefully kind of move them over here, make them smaller, see the steps, but you want to make sure that you preserve that positive intention of making sure that these were accomplished, whatever way that worked out for Ron. And then finally, this thing of future pace, if you make a useful change, then you want to future pace it so that they have some practice with using it in the future. And also, you want to program future adjustments. This is just simply to give them some language to let them know that they can change this anytime they want. Nothing is set in concrete. It's flexible. You try it out for a while. If it works well for you, fine. If you want to make some adjustments, that's fine. So, I think I'll do a brief demonstration. Who thinks they may have a little timeline tuning they'd like to do? And keep in mind, this can be contextual. This isn't like the big timeline of all my life. This could be maybe you want a different kind of timeline in certain business situations or family things or whatever. You could contextualize it also. Anybody got something they want to explore? If not, I'll let you explore it with each other. All right. Come on up. Let's see, let's get you mic'd. That little microphone is floating around over there just for the... So what's up, oh man with many paths?
And again, I have my timeline going out this way, and there were, like you said, many paths to it, many choices, many options. And as opposed from being depressed and all that, and those, but a big shift for me is I got married. And so it's just, my timeline is I'm one thing is I'm really working on adjusting that too. It's just to make more future plans, further future plans, and there's plans that keep getting pushed back, and just keep getting pushed back further as I get closer. You know, things I do want to do, they get pushed back further.
What is it that pushes them back?
Other things that come up, and then all of a sudden they slot themselves in front of it. And well, I'll tell you specifically, one is going to LA and pursuing my acting career in that way, and it just keeps things get jumbled, and something I really want to do, as well as you said, is working more towards business, because my business before was I do some work, have a project come up, do that, and then I'd go off and hike for a month or kayak around or explore something else, and then I'd go work someplace else and then come back and do that. But now I'm looking more to a concrete future as far as being more specific and having more specific plans.
All right. So, you know, I'm getting the impression that one of the positive intentions of the current way that these future events are appearing to you is that there's a lot that you enjoy doing, right?
Yep.
There's some things that you feel that you really want to almost make more important than they have been because other things keep pushing them out of the way, but those other things are important too. And sometimes it's not so much that they're important and they get in the way, they're just kind of interesting or enjoyable and kind of a little path through the forest that you follow for a while, but it takes time away from the thing you really want to be focusing on.
Yeah.
Is that kind of the structure of it?
And before that, my whole life was just, exploring. I was exploring everything.
Right.
All people and everything for me was just a huge adventure and exploration of things.
Right.
However, now it's not really.
So there's more of a kind of a contiguous line, marriage being a major component of that.
Yeah,
and that this timeline, as it comes out, certain future events, anticipations, begin to pop up as being important to the maintenance of this timeline, not only in the relationship, but in relationship to yourself, like the business thing, the acting thing. Those are kind of like major kind of themes that are important. They're not events, right?
Yeah.
It's not like, climb the mountain tomorrow morning is an event, but success at business is more a theme kind of thing.
And that's a great way to put it. It is an event.
Right.
And I state things very much in that way. That was a great event that we went to, we participated in.
Gotcha. Well, let's take both of these. Let's take, first of all, the thing of going to California and exploring the acting career. When you think about that in the future, right? Just as you think about it on your timeline, how do you represent that?
When I think about that on my timeline, it's I represent that as it's a little it's in the distance,
Okay.
and it's you know, and even with the submodalities that connected to it are it's in the distance. It's not particularly clear and or specific and as far as it's
Kind of floating out here, it's
floating
not
out there,
clear
yeah,
and specific, but
it's it's like it's floating. It's not really. It's maybe not even connected. It's just floating, waiting to.
so it's kind of out there in the future, but
Yeah.
there's not even a real sense of it being directly connected to the timeline in any, it's just sort of
Yeah,
there.
yeah.
Okay, so I
Yeah.
got a little bit of information about that in terms of submodality codings of the acting career. Let's look at business, as you were saying, and professional life. How do you represent that, you know, success at business, that kind of thing in the future? How do you see that? How do you imagine it in the future?
Well, immediate future. I mean, there's right after this. I mean, there's definitely plans. But then again, looking at long term, similar to the acting. It's because the immediate plans is very specific. I see them, and they are like.
Like a stack of cards that you're
Like,
gesturing,
yeah,
this, that, then the
yeah,
next thing
they're
has to be done.
definitely in line.
Right.
It's like, and but as far as like further down,
Right.
it's still kind of, and you know, and even when I'm talking further down, I'm talking the acting thing. I'm talking maybe even about I'm not talking 5 years or so. I'm talking maybe in about a year to 6, 8 months.
Okay.
Even,
6, 8 months to a
even.
year, and this is the
Yeah.
business thing or the
The
acting
business,
or
both of them,
Okay.
just kind of, and because you know, immediate
Right.
future is like just, and
Right.
it's getting clearer on the further down, even from 6 months to a year to 5 years and such, and yeah.
Okay, all right. All right, so let me, again, as it says there in the flip chart, we're going to frame this as an exploration, see
Okay.
if it makes a subjective difference in your felt sense of, you know, connection to the acting and, you know, success in business in the future, the way that you code it. Okay, now, from the information I've gathered, just briefly, what we have is a structure of the future in which the immediate sort of task orientation stuff is right here in front of him, very definite. It's kind of like, I get the impression it's almost like a series of cards, you know, or like playing cards. There's one, there's another one, there's another one, another one. These have to be done. Captivates the intent or the, you know, is sort of motivation into these. That's definitely on the timeline. But then there's this sort of these vague, nebulous desires that are out there in the future that are motivating and yet unreal. The acting career kind of floats over here, not in the sense that it's completely connected, and the success in business, same kind of thing.
And this part right here, I mean, it's very exciting. I know I'm
Right.
doing exciting stuff I'd love to do. And,
Right.
And yeah.
What kind of other submodalities does it have? I mean, in terms of when you say it's exciting, is it bright? Is it dim?
Oh, it's
Is it-
bright. There's very clear
Right.
pictures, very clear color
Right.
to it, and it's vivid, very vivid, and not necessarily doing the event, but I just know it's there,
Okay,
and I know it's happening.
right.
And,
Bright, vividness, connected.
Yeah, and it's connected, and
Right.
it's happening, and I'm looking forward to it,
Okay,
definitely.
great. Then here's what we're going to do, an exploration. Here's what I'd
Okay.
like you to do. First, let's take the acting career.
Okay.
Right, and you were saying that the time frame target to really begin to initiate this is sometime 6, 8 months. Is that an appropriate timeline or time frame? When do you want to feel as if you're really in the full flower of that, you know?
I'm looking the full flower. I mean, that's.
Could be years, right? But you,
I'm looking at the full flower of it is I would like to be in it by springtime.
okay, this is an immediate kind of thing.
Yeah.
This year,
Yeah.
right? Or next, yeah.
Next after the new year.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. And the same with the business thing, about that
The
same time frame?
business thing, yeah. I would like these things just to like taken off.
Connected
and
with your business.
Connect with the business. You know,
Right.
many times, okay, I get these gigs, things come up, and again, the business, the sureness and all that just keeps, it's almost just keeps getting pushed back, I mean, sure, I'm having fun, it's exciting
Right.
things, but this is the things I really want.
We just need to connect those, right? So we're going to try it, we're going to experiment in the following way.
Okay.
Take the acting first.
Okay.
Right? Just notice how you've got your timeline structured and how you think about acting. And it's kind of out there floating in this vague, nebulous kind of little bubble. What I want you to imagine doing, and you might want to watch my hands for just a minute.
Okay.
I want you to take that bubble and begin to kind of elongate it. It's almost kind of stretch it, right? So you're taking the leading edge of it, and you're slowly beginning to kind of attach it, let it attach to your timeline, and then it's going to, kind of like a, like a streamlined bubble. It's going to kind of rise up, and it's going to go into the future, and it's going to be like a theme, It's going to be like a vessel, like some kind of a, almost like this bubble. And within that bubble, right, is going to be everything associated with the acting career. It's one of the things that's what's going to live in the bubble. But there's plenty of room in that bubble for lots of other things too. You've got the things that you say are exciting and are right up front. And there's going to be other things in a number of months that are still exciting and don't really have much to do with acting. And they can continue on your timeline. They can kind of move out here, right? But on this timeline, there's this bubble that kind of rises up and gets more and more powerful, right? And kind of extends into the future. But it kind of begins to stretch down almost to the moment now, next month or so. That's where it connects. And then within that, I want you to begin to imagine a series, right, of representations of your acting career, things that you could do. What might you do first? What might you do second? And each one of those, the earliest in time, the closest towards you, one of the first things that you might do, phone call, a connection, or whatever. And then what that might lead to, you want to make that image a little bit brighter and bigger, right? And it fits inside that bubble, that acting bubble. So in a sense, your task is to do two things. Let the normal everyday things kind of persist on the timeline. They're there. But within this bubble, there's a whole series of imagery, right? Kind of like stacked cards that you can see how one leads to the other, and they're bright and vivid. And they're all related to realizing the acting career, right? So you begin to kind of fill that bubble with these images, right? So you kind of see two things at once. You see those images begin to rise up associated with the acting career. Right? And simultaneously, there's these other things, the normal maintenance, day-to-day things that are still compelling, right? But these acting images kind of pop out of the rest of the normal day-to-day things, right? And they're really in your awareness, and they're linked, they're connected, they're grounded to the timeline within this bubble called acting. Right? Just begin to get a sense of that. See what that's like for you.
Okay.
And sequence them appropriately.
Okay.
I have a sense that whole bubble is kind of growing out of the timeline. It's connected like roots, something solid. Make sure to have that brightness, that compelling aspect. What's up with that?
just having it there, and it's just as far as right, especially when you said brightness associated to it, and having that bright and just having it more available and real, and seeing it and being part of it instead of it just floating there, but being part
Connected to it.
connected to it.
Yeah.
And that it's and see, and that it's definitely real.
Not only real, but
opposed to-
important.
and very important. I
Yeah.
mean, it is. It's extremely important.
So get used to that for a moment, right? Because this is creating realities. And you'll notice there's emotion coming up. Right? I mean, what happens when you realize your dreams? You feel something, right? When something that has been a dream of yours begins to become real, and you realize, my God, this can be me. Right? And take some time to let that settle into the reality as a way that you can experience yourself and your path through the future. See, you know those many roads that you were talking about that
Yeah.
you used to explore? Right? They're still there. Absolutely still there. Right? And yet they can appear on this timeline. There was a woman that was with in Hawaii, and she was in one of the groups that we did. And we were walking this very narrow, it was pretty narrow now, narrow trail. And she was afraid of heights, and that narrow trail terrified her. Right? All the other group was like, it's great, we've got a view of the ocean. They just scampered down the trail. She got to the base of that, and she looked up at it and froze. Right? So we spent some time, we started talking about paths and possibilities, etc. And I was telling her how beautiful the bay was on the other side of this little mountain she had to climb over. Not a big hike, but around the corner. And it really is. It's one of the most beautiful little bays in Hawaii. So I painted this beautiful picture for her. So she decided to, kind of trust me and go for it. So when she first started out, it was like, whoa, she really wanted to know where her feet were. She was watching each step. But after a while, her body adjusted to this, realized, hey, I can trust this. And on this relatively narrow path, she went all the way around. When she came down the path, down to the beach in this beautiful bay, she was beaming. And what she said really just stuck with me. She said, all paths are wide. Right? Wide enough for all that reality, all of those explorations. So rather than these separate things radiating out like so, that whole thing is that rainbow path. So no part needs to be denied. All can be expressed. You choose. Then you make the dream real. And this is one of the ways you do it. Specific, small chunk, well, how much would? I don't want it floating there as a dream. I want it connected, bright. I want it there on my timeline, imagery. So when I refer to that, I got that motivation. And keep in mind that things change over time. You know enough about life to understand that. So that as you walk that wide path and explored some of those realities, express that, you can always make adjustments.
Right on.
Right on.
Thank you.
You bet. Cool. Enjoy.
Thank you.
I'll see you on, TBS. Right?
You will.
I got it, man. Absolutely. Cool. Okay, we have, I believe, just about time enough to do this prior to lunch. That'll give us just about 20 minutes per person, which I think is sufficient. Right, so you're going to be together with a partner. You already understand the structure of your own timelines and the submodality codings in addition to location. And you've given some thought to what might be useful to change. So you're going to be together with a partner, and you're going to go, if I can use your example, Ron, just because we're familiar with it. You might say something like, well, you know, I can really get motivated for the future, but sometimes it's just overwhelming, and the way I see it is, you know, the way that Ron described it. And this is something I'd like to change. So then you essentially go through these steps. Frame what you're doing as an experiment, and predict, explore different timeline arrangements, identify the positive outcome, make sure that's preserved, explore how to achieve all the outcomes a person has, and just play with the timeline as an experiment until it kind of goes, whoa, that's the way I'd like it to be, right? And then you future pace it, give them the suggestion if there's something they'd like to change, it's absolutely fine in the future. You can make whatever adjustments that you like. And the bottom line is that if this doesn't work, we can always go back to the way that it was originally. So I want you simply to explore shifting each other's timelines in a useful direction, right? I want you to stay on track at the level of submodalities and not get lost in content, right? Because you get lost in the story and the content. So you want to be an actor. What kind of acting? Oh my God, well I read a Russian actor, and you know, you get down that trail and okay, 3 o'clock. So stay on target, as they say, with the notion of your outcome as the guide in mind. Your guide is to make a useful shift in this person's timeline. 20 minutes is ample time. So the way I think we'll work this is we'll get together with a partner, 20 minutes each, right? Might go a little bit past noon, that's cool. And then just break for lunch. And then we'll be back here as a whole group at 1:30. All right? All right, find a partner and, yes, absolutely.
I've got the, you know, the sort of reverse timeline thinking.
Right.
Which mode may I choose to work with this? What do I want to, you know, I have a new one now
Right.
that I can adopt from
Right.
over there.
Right. My recommendation, and again, this is with ecology in mind, is that you get to know your adopted child. You know, adoption can be neat, right? I would explore that, and then compare it to the way that you previously had done it, and then choose. There's no prescription for it. You're the one that knows what's gonna feel right, what's gonna be the most useful, and that would be the exploration for you.
Okay.
Okay. Ready? Okay, partners, rock and roll.